last week, while Austin was in the hospital and Deputy Secretary had certain authorities, the U.S. carried out a strike in Baghdad. And it was a strike that targeted a senior Iraqi militia leader who was accused of being involved in attacks on U.S. forces. And so this, according to defense officials, was a strike that was pre-approved by Secretary Austin and by President Biden, so that when the time came, the CENTCOM commander, General Kurilla, already had the authorities needed to carry out the strike.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, there's been all this controversy over Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. He's had some health concerns, which is understandable, but there's a lot of talk about where he was, how people were notified within the administration, within the Pentagon, about him being unavailable for medical treatment, and sort of what that means for protocols in terms of communications with the White House, when they have to, cabinet officials have to notify people. Get us up to speed on the situation with the Defense Secretary.
So here's what we know so far. Secretary Austin was diagnosed with prostate cancer in early December. On December 22nd, he went to Walter Reed for a surgery to treat the cancer. At that time, he signed over some of his authorities as Secretary of Defense to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks. The next day, he was released from the hospital and reassumed those duties, and everything was fine, smooth sailing. The White House was not informed of this procedure or the diagnosis at this point. And then on January 1st, he was in severe pain. He was nauseous. He had pain in his hip and his leg. So they took him back to the hospital, where they found a UTI and fluid in his blocking his small intestine. So he was hospitalized the second time, as I said, January 1st. It took until January 2nd for him to designate those authorities to the Deputy Secretary. And there were only 3 people, it appears, in senior DoD circles who knew that he was in the hospital at that point. Part of the reason this sort of ballooned into what it became was because Austin's Secretary of Defense was out sick last week with the flu. And so not only was it that, but a lot of people weren't in the building at the time because it was in that post-holidays time period. So there were a lot of things that went unnoticed, they said, because of the time period. So it took until January 4th for the White House to be notified that Austin was in the hospital. Now again, he was brought to the hospital the night of January 1st. So we're talking 2.5, 3 days where the White House didn't know that Secretary Austin was in the hospital. It took another day for Congress and the public to be notified, and that happened on Friday, January 5th, after the end of business. So they really waited until almost the weekend, essentially, to inform the public that he was in the hospital. It took even longer for them to finally release the reason he was hospitalized, which was the prostate cancer, and then the subsequent complications with the procedure. And so we've heard from both lawmakers on the Hill, people from the White House, as well as members of the media who are pretty upset about the fact that there was such a long period of time where it was unknown that he was in the hospital, he was unwell. And so we've seen the White House as well as the Department of Defense already initiate both reviews on these procedures, as well as already make some limited changes. And so we've heard from defense officials that it's not particularly uncommon for Secretary Austin to delegate some of his authorities to the deputy. For example, the Pentagon press secretary has said that when Secretary Austin is traveling and doesn't have the full means to be Secretary of Defense, he will often transfer some immediate authorities in case, for example, he's on a flight somewhere and doesn't have the full array of communications necessary to carry out the duties of Secretary of Defense. And so when Deputy Secretary Kathleen Hicks was notified of these additional authorities that were delegated to her, it didn't raise any red flags because this is not something that is particularly uncommon. Now, the big part or the big question is, why were the authorities delegated? In this specific example, it's because he was hospitalized.
Right.
And so that's a piece of this that will most likely change moving forward. We've already heard from the White House that they will look to ensure that if there is a transfer of power, part of what's included in that notification process is the reason why.
So I think a question a lot of people have is, given what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Israel, what's going on in the Red Sea, is it really customary for President Biden to go that many days without either speaking to the Defense Secretary or speaking to somebody who would have been designated to exercise these powers, who might have, in the course of that conversation, relayed what was going on with Secretary Austin?
That's a great question. And so what the Department of Defense has said is that there was always a continuity at the helm of the Pentagon, which means the moment Austin was hospitalized, he was still in charge, and then they delegated the authorities to Deputy Secretary Hicks, and there was no lapse or time period where there wasn't someone sort of running the ship, steering the ship. And so, as you mentioned, there's any number of issues going on in the Middle East, but in particular last week while Austin was in the hospital and Deputy Secretary had certain authorities, the U.S. carried out a strike in Baghdad. And it was a strike that targeted a senior Iraqi militia leader who was accused of being involved in attacks on U.S. forces. And so this, according to defense officials, was a strike that was pre-approved by Secretary Austin and by President Biden, so that when the time came, the CENTCOM commander, General Kurilla, already had the authorities needed to carry out the strike.
Right.
And so on the day that the strike occurred, it really fell to him to carry it out and to give the order, as opposed to Secretary Austin, who was in the hospital and had already delegated certain authorities to Deputy Secretary Hicks.
So Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been engaging diplomatically on the whole war between Israel and Hamas. What are some of the things that his recent trip, what are sort of the deliverables during that session?
There are two big things that are sort of front and center right now as it relates to Secretary Blinken's trip to Israel. The first is the possibility of a second front between Hezbollah and Israel. We've seen Israel get more aggressive in some of its targeting of Hezbollah leaders over the last week or so. We also saw them take out a Hamas commander in Beirut. And so there are concerns that even though they've engaged in a limited fighting at the border, this could expand. And so there are concerns from the U.S. since October 7th of a much wider conflict that could bring in Iran and bring in the U.S. in particular. And so the U.S. is doing whatever it takes to avoid a wider conflict. And that sentiment has shaped its decision-making as it relates to Lebanon, as it relates to the militias that are targeting U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria, as well as the Houthis who are attacking commercial vessels in the Middle Eastern waterways. And so the other aspect of Blinken's trip is he very recently tied the idea of Palestinian statehood to what Israel has sought for a long time, which is normalization ties to other Middle Eastern countries, particularly Saudi Arabia.
Right.
We know that in the lead up to October 7th, the U.S. said that they had essentially brokered the contours of a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and that was essentially thrown in the waste bin post October 7th. And so during Secretary Blinken's most recent trip this week to the Middle East, he met with a lot of Arab leaders and then went to Israel. And he said publicly that a lot of these Arab leaders would be willing to consider the possibility of normalization agreements as long as it included both somewhat of an end to the war as well as a future vision for Palestinian statehood.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.